Hello, I'm Emily Abbott from the American Chemical Society. Welcome to this media briefing from ACS Spring 2022. When you take a sip of your morning brew, many of us feel pleasure and are ready to start the day. That feeling of pleasure is a result of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And today I'm joined by a researcher who reports the first application of used coffee grounds to detect biomolecule activity, including dopamine, in the brain. Full circle. Current materials used to detect brain activity with electrochemistry requires expensive and difficult fabrication techniques. This team's coffee ground method is not just inexpensive, but it's also environmentally friendly and relatively easy to produce, and a great excuse to stock the lab with coffee. I'm joined today by Dr. Ashley Ross from the University of Cincinnati, and she leads this team and research projects. Thanks so much for joining me, Ashley.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, so I'm curious, what were you trying to find out? Were you looking for a way to reduce coffee ground waste, or is your research focused on studying brain activity and you just happened across a very convenient starting material?
Very much the second part. So my lab is very much focused on developing new tools to study the brain. And actually, it was funny, my graduate student, Blaze, was giving a group meeting about a year ago, presenting just a random paper looking at making porous carbon materials from waste coffee grounds. And most often this has been used in the past to as supercapacitors for energy storage devices and batteries. And so there's sort of a historical context that a lot of people in my field have been interested in how different sort of geometries of the electrode material, so porous and pore geometries, how that impacts electrochemical sensing. And so we sort of had an epiphany in group meeting last year that we could actually adopt this method to actually making sensing materials and study how different neurochemicals or biomolecules interact with these surfaces. So it was sort of, it happened by chance.
I mean, do they have to be used coffee grounds? Can it just be ground coffee? How would that affect the resulting electrode?
So yes, it does have to be used coffee grounds, and that's because during the brew process, what's left over is this non-soluble residue, and that non-soluble residue contains a lot of cellulose-based materials and other carbonaceous materials that can be used as precursor material for this process. But I want to point out that we have to do a little bit more than just use the coffee grounds and then stick them on the electrode. We do a little bit of a post-processing to activate them and make them conductive, which is really important for electrochemistry. So yes, it does have to be used coffee grounds, but that's also really interesting because now we're able to recycle all the coffee that my lab consumes to make better electrode materials.
Does the type of coffee matter? Could decaf work just as well, in terms of getting the carbon that you need to extract to make these electrodes?
That's an interesting question. So we actually, on a side, are really interested in comparing two major coffee brands head to head. And our goal is to figure out which one makes the best electrode material. It really depends on how conductive that material is after the process. And so we've thought about comparing different types of roast and how that impacts that precursor material that ultimately leads to the material we're making. In terms of decaf, from what I understand in the decaffeination process, it's a really, they report a selective way to remove caffeine from the coffee. And so my guess is that it wouldn't matter because your coffee residue would be very similar after the brewing. But we haven't explicitly tested that.
I mean, are there other waste materials that you could use instead of coffee grounds? And is that something that your lab has thought about doing?
Yeah, so I just honestly started thinking about this about a year ago after I saw that paper, but there is a lot of different biomass or bio-waste compounds that have been used in the past as precursor materials to make these porous carbon structures, including starch and corn grain. We haven't particularly gone that route. Just because my lab is a huge coffee fanatic, so we produce a lot of this in-house in the lab anyway. And I believe coffee is one of the major contributors to bio-waste, so it's actually a useful approach to reduce some of that. So we haven't particularly gone that, but there's definitely other materials that you could use.
So what are the significance of the findings here, and how can this eventually be sort of like implemented in real life?
So for one, a lot like we mentioned in the introduction, that a lot of the ways that people produce carbon-based materials for electrochemistry include a lot of harsh chemicals, are not particularly environmentally friendly, and they also include you have to have access to these heavy-duty reactors as well, oftentimes, to make these sorts of carbon materials. And so this, from an environment and an economic standpoint, it's a really significant way to make sensing materials because it's recycling. And it's a pretty straightforward process, and you don't need heavy-duty equipment like you do in the other approaches. But from the materials side, placing that aside, my lab is interested in really understanding neurochemistry and brain chemistry. And so there's been I don't want to go into all the nitty gritty details, but, for a long time, we've been interested in how geometric, changes in the electrode structure impact sensing. And actually there's been this sort of theory in our lab that in other labs that you can actually manipulate the geometry of your electrode material. And that can actually, there's been evidence that that can improve the ability of your measurement to be faster. And so we use a technique in my lab, use fast scan cyclic voltammetry. And so often we're making these measurements every 100 milliseconds. And some other researchers in our field have shown that porous structures actually improve the temporal resolution because analytes get trapped in those pore structures on the electrode surface. And so from a more significant biological standpoint, we can actually use these materials potentially to make much faster measurements. So that allows us to capture brain chemistry much, much quicker, which is always really important because your brain operates on a really rapid time scale. In terms of real life, I don't know how many people are going to start taking their coffee grounds and converting them to electrode materials, but definitely the application or the impacts of what we could learn about the brain using these materials for sure could impact real life and how we understand brain signaling.
I mean, related to that, like eventually could this be tested clinically on humans to, sort of register brain activity using coffee grounds, exactly what you're studying?
There are a few researchers that have used the techniques we use in my lab, fast scan cyclic voltammetry, to make measurements of neurotransmitter signaling in humans. And they're all on carbon-based materials. Carbon is considered biosafe. Do I think I will be putting these electrodes in humans anytime soon? No. But, maybe a long time down the road, eventually, that they could. I think also from a fundamental standpoint, we'll learn more about how to sense the brain better. And that definitely could be important down the road for human studies.
So what can people take away from this study then? What's sort of like your final plug for the work that you and your team are doing?
I would say don't be afraid to think outside the box. Again, this is an idea that came to us about a year ago. We are very much like, we purchase carbon fibers and we use them in my lab to measure neurochemicals in the brain. And now we are starting to recycle coffee to make electrode materials. And so I think, my lab has a huge love for caffeine. So, using caffeine to literally fuel not only yourself, but your research is also something we never thought we'd be doing. So again, thinking outside of the box and being open to adopting other methods, in other fields adjacent to you to help further your research is really important.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Ashley, for sharing your research with me today.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me.
Be sure to check out our other media briefings for ACS Spring 2022, which will be posted throughout the meeting at www.acs.org/ACS Spring 2022 briefings.